So Greg, first of all, could you introduce yourself and briefly tell us a bit about your career path to date?
Yeah, so my name's Greg Palmer and I'm currently the Public Engagement Manager at the Wellcome-MRC Cambridge Stem Cell Institute. I studied natural sciences at King's College, Cambridge, specialising in physical sciences. Initially came thinking I was doing physics and maths as part of natural sciences, but also wanted to take some more practical options. So I took material science and earth sciences, and that's why I ended up specialising in earth sciences and doing a fourth year swim masters in earth sciences in Cambridge. And I liked that strand of science, and I enjoyed being in the science department. But in doing a master's research project, I decided I didn't want to continue with research itself. I struggled a bit, I think, with the amount of detail, sort of the detailed question you were asking in a research project. But I liked being close to other scientists. So I began quite soon into my master's, to be honest, looking at what I might do as a job where I could still be close to science. And that's how I sort of stumbled into careers in science communication and engagement. And I did a couple of roles in the university departments in communication and engagement after graduation. And I disappeared off to London to work at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew for a bit on science communication. And that was just before returning in 2020 to the university to a full-time public engagement job at the Cambridge Stem Cell Institute.
Great. So it's interesting that you've had the chance to work in a couple of different places in different types of public engagement and communication roles as well. So can you tell us a bit about your day-to-day role and tell us a bit more about what it involves and how you use your scientific background in the work that you do?
Yeah, so as evident from the job title, my major purpose is to manage the public engagement programme at our institute. But I think that encompasses quite a lot of stuff, but in essence, the public engagement programme is a programme of events and activities that I'm responsible for making sure they happen, and they're activities and events that are open to members of community groups and patient groups who would be interested in the scientific research. Almost 30 lab groups do in our building on the Cambridge Biomedical campus. We also have wider scientific networks across the university. So it's not just the people who are based in our building where my office is, but also other people working on stem cell related topics in sciences and humanities around the university. So it's quite useful to have a broad scientific understanding of what's going on, because those are the kinds of topics that we're trying to communicate about, really. When we say events and activities for public engagement, we probably mean anything that's face-to-face or remote. So that can be events in our building where we invite people in to hear about the research, or it can be organising things at outside venues. It can be things online, particularly during the pandemic, and it can be things like through the post or popping up in places people already gather where they might not normally encounter science. And I guess the big part of my role is to facilitate our staff and students to do that themselves. So provide them with opportunities to make those connections with public audiences, and then also sort of run a program that we aim to give researchers the skills and the confidence to do that. So train them, but also reward and recognise the researchers who do it, so that it becomes part of their job as a scientist or as a social scientist or as a humanities researcher, rather than a voluntary add-on that they might do if they're passionate about it. So we're trying to build a program that achieves all of that, but not necessarily doing science communication and engagement myself. I'm not normally the one going out and talking about what our institute does. I'm the one connecting the dots with our team to make sure the researchers can go and make the most of those opportunities.
Excellent. It sounds like a really exciting opportunity to work with such a range of different people and really hear about all of the work that they're involved in. So can you tell us a bit about what attracted you to working in public engagement and how perhaps the role has differed in the different places that you've worked as well?
Yeah, so I think the thing you just mentioned there about connecting with the researchers is what really attracted me. Like it's still a very close relationship to people doing active research projects. So though I didn't want to do that necessarily myself every day as a 9 to 5 job in academia, I was really keen to find a role that allowed me to stay close by. So it works nicely for me. Um, so I guess that's what guides me into this type of role. And then what motivates me day to day is probably that I think it's really important that someone does this role. So public engagement should be part and parcel of the research process. So science should be open and accessible to all. And I think in the Stem Cell Institute, that's really obvious because we have a patient, we have groups of patients who may one day benefit from our research. Possibly bigger picture, people with their condition in the future are more likely to benefit from a lot of what we do. But it's really important that those patients feel they have a voice in these studies about their conditions. Like they're the ones with lived experience of what they go through, and they'll know what impact some of these like medical advances will have. So that's really clear for the sort of clinical side of what we do, like the stuff that has a direct application into healthcare. And I think someone should be making these connections. So if I enjoy it, why not me? And then there's also the flip side of that, where we have a lot of fundamental research as well, and a lot of science can fall into this category where there's not an obvious application for it immediately, but it's going to further scientific understanding. And even lots of that work is funded by taxpayers' money or charitable donations from the public. So if there's not the avenue for the people who are paying for it to find out what's actually happening and what their money's being used for, then we've got a problem. They're unlikely to want to keep paying for it. So that's the kind of motivation for making sure all research, I think, is open and accessible, and that the researchers are sort of engaging with public groups at all stages. So when they have new ideas, but also sharing findings and telling the people who it's going to affect one day. So it's quite rewarding to see it when that actually comes off, like the full cycle of you connect people and then they find out something they didn't know and they then support that research project. And that tends to be whatever sector, field of research you're working in, I think. I guess the most interesting thing on the point about how it differs depending on where you work and where you do a job in science communication engagement probably comes down to the perceived split between communications and engagement. And I would say it's like a spectrum between the two, but there's two ends, and depending on what your role is and where you work, I'd say they can be quite different, what the motivation for doing communication about research or engaging with the public is. At the one end, and I've done jobs where it's very much communications focused, you're normally thinking it's sort of dissemination of research findings or policy aims or gathering support, raising awareness, trying to get donations or funding for the future. And there's normally a really clear ask or an action someone can do at the end of your communication activity. But often it feels like you're talking at people and like you're trying to sell a particular type of view. Sometimes it verges on marketing of research and science. Whereas in my current role, we're very much more focused on two-way interaction as our engagement. So ideally, you'd be doing more listening when talking at people. You'd be hearing both sides of a discussion about a controversial topic in research, or some ethical and social issues about what we do, or the potential impact on patients in the future. And you'd be hearing from patients and researchers, and they'd be having a discussion face to face, whether it's in person or online, about what the implications actually are and how the research may develop in the future. So that's difficult, but it sometimes feels a bit more rewarding because you get a more personal touch, like you hear back from the people you're working with, so you're not just shouting about science into the ether and hoping that awareness is gradually raised or support gradually builds. And I think that differs role to role. Some roles have both. Some roles are very focused on one end or the other. We're fortunate enough in our institute that we have teams doing both, so like you can be a bit more focused. You can try new things, but also you can do all the things that are definitely required of you day to day.
think hearing about that spectrum is really useful, and hopefully will give some clarity for people who are sort of like, what is the difference between engagement and communication, and the fact that you can combine some of that in certain roles, or you can kind of veer one way or the other, would be really helpful for those who are sort of thinking, oh, what type of role do I want, and do I want that interaction, or do I want to be focusing on that outward communication? So some good thinking points for people listening there.
Yeah.
And you've touched on some of these already, but tell us a bit more about the high points and some of the challenges of the work that you do.
Yeah, so often if I'm asked, I say the sort of the fundamental component of what my job is all about relationship building. So connecting people, and in all types of guises. So connecting internal researchers who are really keen and good at engagement with those who have less confidence and skills or experience, connecting external charities, for example, patient charities, with researchers who are funded by them, connecting academics with community groups who've never heard about science before and getting them to have a conversation. So the rewarding bit there is that you get to work with a lot of people, I think, and you get to build partnerships. It's difficult to keep those partnerships sort of sustainable and long lasting, while also finding new ones to keep your program growing. But when you get it right, you get to work with a lot of different people from different backgrounds, with different experiences, and you begin to see the sort of impact of those interactions on individuals. So for me, one of the most rewarding things, like the absolute high point, is when I see one of our researchers who I know quite well because they work in the same building and they work on stem cell topics, actually begin to question or shape their research projects or their ambitions for the future of their career or their projects based on an interaction they've had with a patient who has the condition that they work on, for example, or with a parent or a carer of someone who has a condition that might be impacted by their work. And very occasionally we get new proposals, like for research, that come out of those interactions, like a problem that a scientist thinks they can tackle, but they've just heard of it from a patient or a carer. And those are some of the most interesting things, because you begin to like see the personal impact on an individual's life, essentially, of what you've managed to connect. And normally, like, to be honest, it's not me having any emotional impact, but it's me helping facilitate the moment they've spent together, and then it goes hopefully from there. So that's really nice. And then you just have to sort of balance, make sure you can make as many meaningful connections as you can. That's the difficult bit, I think, keeping them meaningful, making sure you have the right people in the room to have those moments happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're trying to work with so many different people, nurturing those existing relationships whilst keeping an eye on the potential for new ones, it's a bit of a skill to be able to juggle that, isn't it?
And I think you have to be a people person, but you also have to be able to adapt depending on who you're working with. So the approach you take with one scientist is very different to another scientist, let alone a particular community group or a patient who lives with a particular condition or disease every day. So that's like the personal challenge of continuously judging the situation and what experience the people you're trying to bring together actually have, and what works for them, not just what works for me to deliver a strategy tick box to say we've done one thing in 1 year or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like there's a really good point to reflect on for those listening around their skill set and what their strengths are, and whether they enjoy those interactions with lots of different people, and having to adapt based on who they're talking to and what they're trying to achieve with those different interactions as well.
Yeah.
And obviously you're working in an environment where there's lots of external influences on your role. So can you tell us a bit more about the factors that influence your role and how your role might change in the future as a result of some of that?
Yeah, so I would say, like, to the outside world, we as a public engagement professional in a higher education research institute, so a department of the University of Cambridge, we're affected by a lot of similar things to the external factors affecting the researchers themselves. So they work on funding cycles for their projects, and those funding cycles often are what funds our public engagement work as well. So we're a bit beholden to those and how they change, and the funders' desires for public engagement and their scientific aims. And then also sort of the turnover of scientists. Scientists in particular are forever moving around labs within the university to other universities, from the private sector to the public sector. And you sort of have to make the best of what you've got in the moment you're working in. So for the people in particular, it's just a case, I think, of keeping track of who you're working with at that time and what works for the researchers. So we could be working with one research group who then move on to a different university overseas, for example. They're still working on the same topics, but we're now not working to do their public engagement. I'm at the institute, so they will probably be replaced. And as they change and groups move, we have to work out what works for those new scientists and what they're interested in, what they'll get out of taking part in our engagement activities. The public audiences are normally still there, and you might then be working with them on something slightly different. They might be confused if the topic changes or you stop a line of research. In actual fact, just like for the scientists, it's going on, but it's probably just going on somewhere else now. I think the professional aspects that affects, like, if life as a public engagement professional, the more professional sort of concern I would have is around like the job security, to be honest. So we work often on fixed term contracts, like many scientists, particularly like postdoc researchers who are funded by projects. So it's not necessarily always a secure role. There are lots of public engagement professionals whose funding for their job is patchy. Either their sort of time is bought out on lots of different projects, or they have short fixed term contracts. And it's similar for people who are in charity or voluntary organizations doing similar roles. Their funding is not so certain many years in the future that we can be offered fixed term contracts that are permanent contracts. And sometimes that's difficult, particularly if you are looking to relocate. Lots of people can't afford to relocate to their dream job if the contract only says it's 12 months initially and requires further funding to be continued. So it's a little bit uncertain, and then that also affects things like whether you get to fully deliver what you start in a project. Sometimes you can join midway through, or they'll have to wrap up sooner than you'd hope. And where you progress afterwards. So it's not necessarily, I don't think, always clear upward steps, because there are often fragmented pockets of people doing public engagement. And there's 2 people doing public engagement at our institute. If I wanted a more senior public engagement role, I'd have to look outward. And that's sometimes not what people want. If you join a giant company, then there might be a much more clear ladder up if you just want to keep progressing. And I know that's not just me. Those are the sorts of conversations that public engagement professionals have in conferences and networking meetings. The same sort of themes come up all the time.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to hear how the research kind of culture and environment is mirrored in the public engagement world. And certainly for anyone who was perhaps looking at this as an alternative to an academic research career, if there are things that perhaps don't sit comfortably about the nature of and the practical side of that career, it's worth looking at how that's mirrored in the public engagement world as well, and weighing up whether that's going to work for them as an individual to move around. I'm sure many would love the flexibility and the opportunities to move around and try new things as well.
And I think there are some companies have roles that do similar things, similar duties, and they're promoting science that's commercial or something, or they're doing outreach programs that are long running. And sometimes those roles, they can be permanent, or at least longer term, and give people more certainty. But for me, that was that's a step too far removed from like the purpose of what the research is that I wanted to support.
Yeah, so some really good thoughts there about what's important to you as an individual when considering this as a career path, and that will determine whether it's right for you, but also the type of environment that you might want to do it in and the type of engagement role you might want to have. definitely. So looking back to your time at Cambridge, was there anything in particular that you did to help you explore this career path further? And how did some of those activities help to get you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, a scientific background helps a little bit, like in my role. I think it's not the be all and end all for my job today that I did a science degree by any means. But like when I was at Kew, it was more environmental science focused. I've worked in the earth sciences department before as well. My degree knowledge was more useful. What's probably universally applicable to all the jobs I've had since graduating is the time I spent sort of volunteering and seeking out opportunities to do outreach and engagement while I was an undergrad. So I was both doing some of those activities myself, like hands-on communication of science, doing hands-on activities or going into schools or volunteering for public talks and that kind of stuff, but also beginning to help coordinate them behind the scenes. So just developing a bit of an understanding of the logistics of coordinating a school visit or working with museums, which we're lucky enough to have lots of in Cambridge, applying for funding, and sort of like the theory behind some of the widening participation work that university does. Like all of those things force you to think about whether that's actually something you want to do day to day and have a strategic responsibility for, rather than just participate in as a sort of a part of your science work or research work if you're not a scientist. So once I came to be, doing my master's and I was doing the science, but maybe seriously thinking about jobs and enjoying the outreachy engagement elements more, that was like quite a good indication to me. And I think it came quite early, and I'm fortunate for that like a grad scheme on a linear job was not what I wanted to do, but I was quite attached to the university setting. And was it worth applying for some jobs that would be hands-on right away, where I could try this, but actually sort of 5 days a week, 9 to 5, would I enjoy it as my main endeavor? And luckily for me, that seemed to still be rewarding. Like it didn't, maybe now I do it as a full-time job, I'd be a lot less willing to also do it as a voluntary thing outside of work hours. But I think that's normal. You want the activities you do as a voluntary thing to be different, but I'm not sure for everyone the jump from volunteering to paid work as your 9 to 5, 5 days a week all year is going to be the thing. So I think it's good to try that and see if you find it rewarding and fulfilling.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. If in doubt, give it a go and see how you feel about it. And even if you learn it's not what you want to do in the longer term, you'll have got something out of it that you can take into whatever the next step might be. Definitely.
I've known people who've done a science communication or public engagement job for a while and then dipped back into a scientific research PhD, for example, because they missed the lab. Perfectly normal. Not me, very much not me. I do not miss like lab work. But I've also known people who either go into science communication through like further study, so like a master's in science communication, or do a little bit of a hands-on job and then take that on later. Like maybe they miss studying, but they want to know more about the theory of communication and engagement rather than the lab work they support and the scientists they support. So there's lots of like routes if you get a job and then you decide maybe I want to do something slightly different. It doesn't limit you from effectively jumping back into pure academia, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll be really reassuring for people who are kind of sitting on the fence at the moment about which route they'd like to go, that trying one thing doesn't close the door to something else. And that's certainly something we've heard from other people that have been involved in this video series as well. So hopefully a very reassuring message for those who are tuning in. So you have now kind of become a manager and have recently been involved in recruiting a public engagement coordinator. So can you tell us a bit about what you look for when recruiting someone or when people are applying to these roles?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing for me is to remember that you're, particularly when you're working in something like public engagement, you're not necessarily going to always be up against a field who are in all scientists, and that is good. So it is useful to have scientific knowledge, but most of the core skills, I would say, can be just demonstrated through any combination of study, volunteering, like with societies, or just outside university, or work. And people don't have to have gone to university to work in like the field I'm in. And sometimes the mixture of experience and backgrounds is very useful when you're working with lots of diverse communities and trying to make cultural connections in your work. Like, you don't want to have a team of pure scientists who've decided to do engagement, approaching different community groups and saying, we're nothing like you, but we'd like to work with you. If we wanted that, we could probably just ask the scientists to make all the connections themselves. So really, I would focus more on the approach to public engagement, the project coordination skills that you can bring to a role, and sort of then work into the knowledge of an academic setting. For example, how research and engagement mesh for the scientists who are doing it day to day. So that's sort of like, if we're recruiting for a project coordinator role, those experiences again can come from any one of work, study, volunteering, but it doesn't necessarily have to every time be an academic example, aside from the lab, or from something you've been taught. I think the other thing that's really interesting in like the public engagement sphere is creativity is quite useful, and a collaborative approach. So we talked about working with people. So obviously, you need to be collaborative and do something that works for everyone. And then we talk a lot about co-creating projects. So projects aren't dictated by my public engagement team. We sort of bring the people together and devise a project as a group. So you need to be creative about what works for everyone. But also, if you are more too regimented, too strict on what you tell people you're doing, sometimes it doesn't end up working for anyone. And then you don't have very impactful engagement. So that requires a lot of time and group work, patience, but also like willingness to be open to new ideas, I guess. So you're looking for evidence of all of those kinds of things when someone tells you about a project they've worked on before, or a particular, they might have heard from something even that's happened elsewhere that they weren't involved in, but if they can demonstrate why the approach that was taken was interesting and how it might fit with our approach to engagement, and what we have a published strategy, so how it might fit with our published strategy for engaging with patient and community groups, then that's great, because it shows they understand at least what we're trying to do. And then all the day-to-day skills you can sort of learn on the job, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how many skills and qualities that you look for are very much the transferable skill set that you can develop through so many different activities, and actually you don't have to have done one specific thing to be able to demonstrate that. The variety is something that is definitely valued, which is good news for those who have perhaps tried a few different things and are feeling a bit unsure about whether they're evidencing their skill set, but also for those who are sort of thinking, but I've not got direct work experience. Actually, there's a lot of other examples that can be used to get those bits of evidence across.
And I think that the other thing to remember is, if you're a scientist and you're wondering about a career in this, like, the world's best stem cell scientist will not necessarily be the world's best communicator and engager with stem cell research. They certainly also might not be the best person to facilitate others to do that. So they are different skill sets. Some people are a bit of both. Some people are only interested in one or the other, and so have no desire to sort of develop their skills. But they're all things that sort of, complementary, but it's not that you don't have to be the world's best scientist to work in public engagement either, or get the job in a public engagement team at a stem cell research lab.
Yeah, that's really good advice and really reassuring, I think. So to finish off, can you tell us one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's looking to get into public engagement and science communication?
Yeah, so I think it's all about trying to find what you personally find rewarding. So what would actually motivate you to communicate or engage people with science day to day? So some people will want to be very hands-on. They might want to write about science every day, or they might want to deliver hands-on workshops or be in the media. That's not what I do, because I'm quite content to not do that myself. I'm much more interested in facilitating scientists to do that as part of their job. And then the scientists get something out of it, but I'm sort of a backseat participant in the actual activity at the end. I think if you dabble in it alongside research, for example, and then think, no, I love this, this is what I want to do all the time, that's great. You have quite a good idea then of what kinds of roles you'd be looking for. You might want to be a radio presenter and be responsible for science. You might even verge way off into like journalism or something like that eventually in your career. But I'm very much more like in the professional services category of staff at the university. You know, I perform a function to support others. And that's what keeps me close to the research, but a breadth of research. So I liked getting straight into that, like learning about my specific area of research that I support and then finding novel ways to do engagement around it. Like that was great for me. I could still decide that I want to study more, and a lot of people do that studying element there, like getting a master's in science communication or doing postgraduate study before they look for a job, which is great. You come in with sort of more theoretical understanding, and then you know right away what you think works and doesn't, and what other people have been up to across the sector. But I think I was a bit done with university, so not choosing that route and stopping studying and sort of going into an entry level but a practitioner's role and like learning on the job was a good fit for me. There are quite a lot of entry level jobs like that in Cambridge because there's lots of organizations doing this kind of stuff. So I think if you drill down into a job description and work out exactly how much time each day or each week you'll be spending doing the activity versus supporting others to do it, is possibly the most useful thing when you're first looking for a role.
Yeah, I think that's some really good advice with that whole variety of work, to think about what is it that motivates you, and do you want to be the hands-on delivery person, or do you want to facilitate, or something that sits in the middle? And that's some excellent advice to encourage people to think about where they want to sit with that and to try it. And if one balance doesn't work, the fact that you can change and try something different until you've worked out what does work for you is a real positive, especially for those who are just starting out on their career. So really encouraging.
Yeah, and at the entry level, the other thing I would say, particularly around sort of jobs in higher education, is that often you can do elements of what I do, like public engagement or science communication, it as part of another job. So if you're not sure, you know, in a job description, that might be the responsibility of a person with a broader job title or with other duties alongside. So if you are interested in sort of the administrative side, you might be able to do some of that as well as dabbling in public engagement activities. And then try it, and then you can go from there if you've had a bit more experience across the board, if you're not quite sure straight away. And then if you widen the pool to that, there's loads of roles that touch on the same kinds of things and tasks.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think the variety is really there for those who want to explore it with this field, and across higher education. In fact, there's a lot of opportunities to explore career paths. So it's really good advice to drill down into the job descriptions and have a good look, because you might find elements of this in jobs where you wouldn't anticipate it from the job title as well. So good to have a dig around and see what's really involved in different roles. Great advice. Greg, is there anything else you'd like to add at this stage, or anything else you'd like to say that we haven't been able to cover so far?
I don't think so, no.
Lovely.
I think touched on most things. I'm conscious that I didn't say much about where I actually work. So it depends really on whether you want me to elaborate on what sort of the place of work, because I think that might be of interest, but also, you know, it's a university workplace, so it's a bit less alien to most people who probably will watch this.
Yeah, I think in terms of this, I think the majority of people watching and listening will likely have had some sort of passing relationship with public engagement and science communication. So I think you're fine not to go into the detail there, because I think the part that we get the most uncertainty from people who come to see us is like, but what about the actual job and navigating, getting in and understanding the different roles, which I think you've covered really, really well. So thank you for all of that.
No, that's fine.
So the last thing to say from me is just thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us and share your career journey with us, because it's been really great to hear both your experience and also all of your advice as well. So thank you very much.
No problem. You're very welcome.